another way is to think about slaves as people who are kind of exploit. They are not in control of their labor, and they only get sort of basic remuneration or kind of subsistence wages to survive. They're kind of it's about kind of conditions of labor exploitation. The problem with this argument is, again, somebody in one society could have their labor exploited in certain ways and be considered a slave. In another place, they're getting their labor exploited and they're just considered a free person. So an alien could come to America and say, wow, there's these two classes of people. There's these people who have like white collars and they're kind of going around and ordering things and going to McDonald's and they order food at McDonald's. And then there's these other class of people who are blue collars and they're making the food and they're sort of barely able to scrape by and they're so they could say these are the slaves and these are the free people. But I mean, we wouldn't think that way. We would probably be offended by this. But you're kind of creating lines that those societies might not see themselves. Okay. And those lines also where they fall are going to be very different in different societies. So another way, and this is kind of maybe the most common way to think about slavery today, is to think about compulsion and coercion, right? A slave is someone who lives in like a coercive environment. They're coerced to work. They can't walk away. They basically just get subsistence wages. And that's the difference between kind of slavery and not non-slavery. And this is really behind a lot of the definitions of what people call modern day slavery. Now, it's very important to remember that when people talk about modern day slavery, they don't mean it metaphorically. So they don't mean like, oh man, my boss is really riding me. I'm like a slave, No, they don't mean you feel like. They mean you are actually a slave. You are a continuity of slavery that continues into the present, right? But of course, there's no legal slavery. So you can't point and say you're not free legally. You're legally property. Because there's no legal slavery anymore. So we talk about conditions of especially coercion. Right. The problem is, how do you determine what's regular coercion versus slavery coercion, right? So we could say that, let's think about this. What's the difference between a Indian person who goes to work in the Persian Gulf? He thinks he's going to have a great job, or he knows it's going to be tough, but he goes. Thinks he's going to make some money. He surrenders his passport. He can't leave the work site. He sleeps in a dorm. He's very controlled about where he can go, when he can leave. He's worked really long hours. He's paid very poorly. He can't leave on his own. He's signed up for a certain amount of time, right? What's the difference between, so at a certain point, we might say that those conditions are so bad that he's like a slave. Mm-hmm. But there's also conditions that we'd look at and be like, this is like not the best job, but he wants to do this. He knew about it. He chose to do this. So I know other people want to do it. He's grateful for this opportunity. So how do you tell the difference between a bad job for us, like from my perspective, what I would think is a bad job that I don't want to do, versus somebody who's being coerced? And we can arrive at conclusions like that, but they're very clearly there's going to be an element of subjectivity in there, and it's going to depend on who's doing the decision, who's making the decision.
And you have in your book, I've noticed, you've spoken about the expanded definition of slavery in today's world to include like debt slavery, for example, where you're financial.
Yeah. So it's interesting.
An interesting expansion of it due to activist influence, the United Nations, and so on. It's no longer simply a more narrow, like in America, where it's very racialized. You have racial slavery. One race is slaving another, which is perhaps the most famous example in the West, at least. But this is very different, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think I call in the book like inflation, like kind of slavery inflation or something, an inflation of the term, because so you'll see people. So if you look at studies on modern day slavery, a big chunk, if not the majority, but a big chunk of modern day slaves are basically what's called bonded labor, which are essentially indentured servants. Like, I agree that I'm going to work for you and you're going to surrender a number of my freedoms in return for some kind of payment over a period of time. And that's like, or maybe debt slave, where I've gone into debt and I can't pay you back. So I work for you until I pay you back. Right. So these are two very common forms, especially bonded labor. So if you look back at the 1956 treaty on ending practices similar to slavery, but not slavery, they very clearly defined, it says bonded labor is not slavery. It says it's a servile condition, but it's not slavery. Right. So from 1956 until today, there's actually a change in the definition. For now, maybe the majority, certainly a huge proportion of modern day slaves are actually bonded laborers, whereas in 1956, this was not considered a type of slavery. Now, this might seem like, okay, well, that's interesting. But think about this. you get this with like kind of white nationalists or just sort of white people who kind of want to see history in a different way than maybe is accurate. But they'll say things in America. They'll say, well, my ancestor, for example, came to Virginia as a indentured servant in the 1650s.
Yeah.
So that you see some people be like, well, my ancestors were slaves too because they were indentured servants. And then people say, no, they weren't slaves. Okay, first of all, they chose to do that, unlike Africans who were taken by force.
These are colonists who emigrated from England, presumably.
Yeah. Second of all, their conditions were nowhere near as bad. And third, their condition was not permanent, right? So they had an indentured service contract for like 7 years or something, and then they were free. Okay. Now, forget about the fact that in Virginia and Maryland, the punishment for an indentured servant who ran away was either mutilation or death. Okay. Wow. Forget about the fact that a lot of slaves brought from Africa in that period in the 1600s also were freed, right? But this is before the idea of like slavery being black people and white people being free. Before this idea kind of gelled in the American colonies in the late 1600s.
Right.
But also, here's the big problem, which is if somebody comes and says today, that's an insulting thing you just said, because you're saying that your ancestor's experience, who was like some white guy who decided to become an indentured servant, is like my ancestor who was a black African who was taken up from their home and put through this horrible middle passage and brought to America and enslaved for the rest of their life. I agree. Those things are not similar. But here's the problem. According to modern definitions of modern day slavery, indentured servants were slaves, right? So, and you can't, if you say, okay, yeah, they were slaves, but not really slaves. No, modern day slavery I said that it's not a metaphor. They mean these are actual slaves. Like there were slaves in America in 1700, there are slaves today.